So Miles' first great quintet by 1958 is sort of dissolving. There's rampant drug use. Um, Philly Joe Jones, his problems are pretty dramatic. Miles has struggled to find his sobriety. Coltrane's kind of in and out of being functional and completely unfunctional. And again, unfunctional in a jazz sense is it's a relative thing. But with Miles and his new sobriety and his new vision quest, that first quintet was becoming untenable. Uh, Chambers was also kind of misbehaving, as Fats Waller once said. I don't know if Red Garland had a problem, but Miles had dismissed him one day for being late. He had Wynton Kelly sitting in his chair and pretty much fired Red Garland in the most callous and Miles Davis sort of ways. The amount of awful stories you hear about Miles from musicians, how he was treating them, and again, a lot of it's probably just driven by Miles' own insecurity. You kind of overcompensate at times when you're the little guy, when you're an outsider, which Miles obviously always kind of was. Which is the weirdest thing when you think about Miles' career, because he's been given that kind of mainstream power and that ultimate thing that we think of as the most successful jazz musician. I don't think he often saw himself in that light. I think he was very much a copycat follower and trying to be accepted. And he knew he was often lesser than as a player around his peers. So being a small guy, being from outside of the black community, being middle class, brought by a dentist father in St. Louis and suburban St. Louis, darn near rural their farm was, I guess. Having more opportunity, being sent to Juilliard. Miles was not the average black kid in a ghetto. Just wasn't. But he wasn't a white guy either, because obviously he's as dark as it gets. And so Miles was always kind of an outcast. He was never really part of a large group that made him feel like he belonged. When he joined the bebop movement, he was very much, a lesser player compared to some of the greats that were doing it at the time. And as he finds himself, he finds that mute, the Harmon mute, and does kind of come into his own legend, as it were, and is part of some of the great groups in jazz history. He's obviously one of the greatest recruiters, having the huge paydays behind his ascending star, especially once he goes to Columbia. It was probably the best paying job in jazz. That being said, it was still a revolving chair of musicians that it wasn't like Blakey who said, your time here is done, go out and start your own band. It was, we can't, even for the money, it's not worth it for a lot of these guys. And Miles dismissed a lot of guys fairly out of hand as well. And there was a struggle with Miles finding replacements for that quintet. That happens for, 4 years, 5 years. He's really trying to reconfigure a group that's going to work and have some of that same potency. And potency is not always the most easy thing to bottle. It might sound like, we just find the most potent lineup, but there needs to be a congealing, a unity, a kind of a sense of force that we bring as a unit. And it's hard to do that with a leader that's not always in the trenches with you. Miles was known to even get off the stage at times when certain guys were playing. Wasn't much of a communicator. But that being said, Miles is in 1958. He's now signed with Columbia. As we move into 1958, Miles is now, like I said, firmly entrenched at Columbia. His first few records are on the scene now for that label, really kind of broadening the scope of Miles and his band's career. He's about to embark on that sextet with Cannonball, Adderly, and with Bill Evans, Wynton Kelly off and on, again, because of the politics of Miles Davis's group. And Miles wanted Bill Evans because Bill Evans knew George Russell's new modal sounds. But as we get into 58, Miles kind of actually joins Adderly, Cannonball Adderley's group. And even though it's kind of billed as a Cannonball Adderley group, something else, most people will acknowledge this is really a Miles Davis session on Blue Note where he wasn't contractually signed and couldn't really be a leader. And so he allows Adderley that leadership. Well, he doesn't allow it. There's not really a choice in the matter. Adderley's kind of come up from Tampa, Florida with his brother Nat, two of the great young players in the new sounds of hard bop. They migrate to Chicago, I think, first, and then into New York. They both make some fine records for Savoy in the mid-50s. Then for Emerson in Chicago, they do some great records in the late 50s. Adderley's star is on the rise. He's becoming seen as one of the new young voices of the alto. And he's got tenacity, character, personality. He's jovial, so there's a real lightness and spring of foot to his playing. You know, it bounds like a gazelle, like a meadow deer. Cannonball. He's just a wonderful, vivacious, light meringue of a player. And Miles is cloying and heavy and almost sour. You know what I mean? So what you have here is a lemon meringue pie. You got that lemon custard of Miles that's tangy and tart and a little bitter, acerbic, hints of sour sadness. Then you have this kind of floating, fluffy, intricate, delicate, light, spirited playing of Adderly. And so there's a real dichotomy there, a real antithesis, yin and yang, if you will. Which, again, that's part of what makes Coltrane and Miles so magical, is that negativity of Miles versus that positivity of Coltrane creates a yin-yang. A negative and a positive creates an energy, a magnetism, and I think we're all drawn to those type of relationships in music. Lennon and McCartney is another great example of that dynamic. The one had a much different personality than the other. They came from music from a different kind of point of view, and it was those 2 points of view, when presented together, that often created the most magical Beatles songs. And I think a lot of Miles and Coltrane has that same dynamic. And with Adderley and Miles, you again get a certain degree of that element where it's a rejoicing, happy to be here, Cannonball Adderley. And I'm not sure what I'm presenting today, but I feel resentful Miles, you know? And I'm sure Miles had his good days where he was a fun guy to be around, but those stories seem short and distant and seem more for publicity's sake and for people in documentaries talking about how great Miles was. Like, those stories all seem a little bit forced and for the camera. It's the more musician to musician dialogue that you read and hear about in liner notes and interviews, and down to the windmill of time, you hear these stories, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of just fun, lighthearted days around Miles Davis. And his playing kind of reveals that. It's always kind of dour. It's always kind of heavy. In spite of its minimalism, it's a heavy, sodden-placed, dense sound. And I'm not of clear mind. That sound reveals that my mind is a little bit at war with itself. And that's part of what Miles is. That's part of what makes Miles Miles. It's part of the special dynamic that makes him, I think, very listenable and intriguing, is delving into the psyche that creates that sound. And so here we have two very different people, and under contractual obligation, working under Cannonball Adderley's name at the great Blue Note label at the very end of the 1500 sequence, number 1595. And I've made a lot of episodes on Blue Note over the years. It's well documented from my videos, and I'm sure others as well. That Blue Note late 1500s from about 1564, 1565 through 1595. It's one of the greatest runs any jazz label's ever done. It's just release after release of incredible, on the edge, cutting edge hard bop with an incredible, uh, strong social driving consciousness of tenacity and resistance and political change and the climate of post-war America. All that stuff's coming out in that hard bop. And so here, Cannonball Adderly is, who again is not really a Blue Note guy either. That's kind of the weird thing here. Is neither of these guys are really Blue Note guys. Miles does record for Blue Note back in the early 50s, 52, 53, but he's not a Blue Note guy by this time by any stretch. And what's also interesting here is that the sideman, piano, Hank Jones, he's a Savoy guy through most of the 50s. He's in a lot of Savoy sessions as a leader and as a sideman, along with that great Savoy trio rhythm section with Wendell Marshall and Kenny Clark. Those three guys are just stalwarts at Savoy. But Hank Jones is one of the leading piano players of the time. And because of the label he was on, we in the present have kind of lost perspective of how important Hank Jones is. But he's really a giant. He's really one of the most beautiful, melancholic, artistic players with a delicate, romantic touch that always susses out the right medication. He just knows how to play the perfect thing for the piece. He's one of the best at distilling all his ideas down in the spot, in the moment, into the perfect one. He's really a unique specimen in that regard. Sam Jones is a bass player at Riverside, predominantly playing on a lot of great Riverside sessions. He does show up at Blue Note some in this era, but again, not really kind of a prime Blue Note guy, leaving the drummer, the great Arthur Blakey, as the real Blue Note guy here. And it's a wonder the record wasn't under his name in some ways, because he was the most under contract for sure Blue Note guy at this session. But it must catch Cannonball Adderly in between his MRC and his run at Riverside. Maybe there's a little bridge there where he's able to make that leadership role. He goes to Riverside, though, and this is one of his albums at Riverside. He makes a great string of records at Riverside, okay? But he also joins Miles' sextet in 58, into 59, into 60. He's doing his own thing with his own group. He's also playing with Miles, getting that payday. And it was probably a pretty fun sextet to be a part of. And even though the piano chair changes some with Bill Evans and Wynton Kelly and Red Garland of Dismissal, and Jimmy Cobb comes into the band at one point because of the drug issues of Philly Joe Jones. You know, it's eventually Wynton Kelly, Philly Joe, Jimmy Cobb and Paul Chambers all depart together. Of course, by that time, I think Cannonball Adderley's already departed himself. So it wasn't a long relationship with Cannonball and Miles. But this is towards the front end of that dynamic. And what you have here is a record that works incredibly well. And from my reading and understanding, Miles is kind of leading the arrangements and the sessions. And of course, with Blue Note, you have that rehearsal time, which really helps to finite and to work out details and to get people on the same page. And in an art form where improvisation is important, it is somewhat necessary to have people on the same page emotionally, spiritually. Where are our thoughts this morning? And spending a few days together before you do some tracking gives us a chance to dialogue, gives us a chance to break bread. And it can lead us to going back in and having a kind of a communal personality, a communal place of mind, heart, soul, and spirit, which allows us sometimes to channel magic when we start playing. Because my ears and empathy aren't just hearing you musically, but I'm also sensing where you're coming from emotionally. And I know that you're a little more angry about that than I am, but I can still be empathetic with you, and then I can respond with my empathy towards your anger. And then this guy here might have a great feel of resistance, but he doesn't maybe think violence is the answer. But it's all this connected kind of thinking around a common central theme. And being black men in America, that's never too far removed from the equation. And so a lot of these songs are just vehicles for the emoting process to take place. And you find Miles in a setting where, again, I feel he's got some humility to him. There's often a sense of kind of brash bravado, especially when he's got Coltrane or Shorter in his group. He almost seems to puff out his chest a little bit and be a little bit more insolent and cocky, you know. And I think when he's more struggling to find his way to some degree, there's a tenderness and a vulnerability that opens up in his playing that I think really makes him honest. And honesty is, after all, what we're all looking for from our artists, from the emoting process. And I think that's something that with Miles Davis, you got to really work to sense what's happening. And I think there's a lot of records. So here you have these guys recording together, kind of finding each other on the same page after some time spent together. And you're getting this really honest Miles, like I was saying. And I think that's such an important thing. I think that's why I gristle at times to Miles, because it feels a presentation of who he wants us to think he is. It lacks honesty at times. Some of his playing, I feel like it's putting up walls as opposed to breaking walls down. What ends up coming out of that session is one of the greatest Blue Note records of all time. One of Miles Davis' best sessions in his whole career, of hundreds of sessions. And what might be the seminal Cannonball Adderly album. This might be his most legendary recording. And it's a tough thing to say any one record by a jazz player is his greatest record. But this record is a legend. And from the beautiful melancholic playing on Autumn Leaves, where Hank Jones defines some of the most elegant and rapturous playing, with his melancholic spacing and the tinkling of a leaf that doesn't fall straight down. It kind of, like, it's amazing what Hank Jones channels on this record. Some of the other tracks are equally as forceful and as beautiful. Love for Sale is fantastic. Something Else here is wonderful. One for Daddy-O is coming up here. And One for Daddy-O is a reference to Daddy-O, who was a Chicago personality on the radio. Large in the black community. He was a follower of rhythm and blues and jazz. He helped present and make popular and suggested certain artists to local labels for production and for recording sessions. He was a pretty big personality at the time in Chicago. At the Argo label, he does 4 or 5 records called Daddy-O Presents, where he's actually taking local Chicago talent, introducing them to Through Chess Records on the Argo label, and they're putting out these records as Daddy-O's recommendations. And that's how big a name he was. Like, Argo Chess is using his name to help promote some of this new talent, which oddly enough is a role that Cannonball Adderly himself gets into. When he goes to Riverside Records, there's a whole series of records called Cannonball Adderly Presents. And it's him doing the exact same thing as Daddy-O, where he's taking friends, talent he's heard about through the grapevine. And in some ways, the best talent scouts you have are other musicians. You know, just like in basketball, the other players in the big leagues are going to hear the rumors of young talent coming up. You want to keep your ear to that. You know, listen to that. And it's just an impressive record on so many fronts. You know, it's wonderfully produced by Rudy Van Gelder. And it shows Cannonball kind of reaching a maturity here. And having Miles and Cannonballs play off each other really is a unique exchange. And I'm not sure whether I could find a comparison even. Uh, it's hard to compare to Cannonball Adderly in a lot of ways. Uh, there's not a ton of alto players that come to mind right away. So you're like, oh, he sounds just like Cannonball, or Cannonball sounds just like so and so. And of course, everyone borrows from a few players, including Parker and Johnny Hodges, and a few characters like that. But Cannonball definitely has kind of his own thing, even coming from Florida. He's just kind of just a different character, and he certainly has this kind of new awareness of self and his career potential. He's working with that Miles group, so there's just his exposure's changing, and it's just a wonderful. And Blakey is actually quite a restrained uh, deliverer of the melancholic groove. Like, he's not pushing or straining. He's fun, wonderful interplay between these two on first song of side two, something else. But again, and it says in the back here, Miles Davis performs courtesy of Columbia, and Hank Jones by courtesy of Capitol Records. And so that means Hank Jones has already moved on to Capitol from Savoy, which he does only for a brief year or so is he at Capitol. And he makes 3 records, maybe 2 records only at Capitol. One's a Porgy and Bess replicant, and there's another one in there that's the Delicate Touch or something like that. They're fine records, but Capitol always has a bit of a distillation process, trying to make something that's very approachable for white America due to their distribution and where their records are going to be seen and going. So, again, this is a legendary record. It's a legendary record for Miles' inclusion. One of the last time we see Miles as a sideman, absolutely. For Cannonball's maturity, for the interplay between the two opposite personalities, the great rhythm section with Sam and Hank Jones, and of course Arthur Blakey just being like, people forget Blakey has delicate, and Thunder can be delicate. Sure, Thunder could clap and roll and thunder across the sky, but Thunder can also be a gentle, soft rain, or it can be a gentle, soft background thunder. And Blakey's got that. He's got that ability to just be the softest of touches, which is an interesting thing that you don't really associate Blakey with a lot. And so what you have here is a lot of guys grafting their sound and their personality to this new quintet that it's a little shame in a way we didn't get more from. Because what an all-star session with an all-star lineup playing great songs. We got to get a little bit of One for Daddy-O here. Again, it's got elements of the blues throughout it. And I've been on the record as saying this before, and I'm going to say it again. Jazz that does not have the blues in it, it gets other names for a reason. And you don't have to even be playing the blues, but you can play with the blues. And it's a feeling. It's a very expressive way to play. The rigidity of just notes and numbers and clear tonality. You need to have the blues at times, because it's the blues that gives you those blue notes. Those notes that make you feel something guttural. And this is just a masterpiece of the black jazz experience, from the black church to the blues to the urbanity of the black migration to the north. It's just all somehow wrapped up in this wonderful record by these wonderful young men who by this point are kind of, Blakey's definitely middle-aged. Hank's probably middle-aged at this point as well. Miles is getting towards the middle of his career. Cannonball is probably the most useful of the bunch. I'm not sure. Sam Jones was probably fairly young as well at this point. And but again, it's just such a great record. And I hope that everybody should have this record in their collection. And that's kind of what this LP Legend series is about, is trying to kind of say these are records that are absolutely seminal to any collection and are possibly, if you had to pinpoint one record by this artist, their linchpin. It's their record that if you had to put one in the vault for a time capsule, probably put in something else by Cannonball, Adderly. And there's a number of other great Cannonball records. Don't make any mistake about that. But something else probably is the one that leaps to the front of the pack. And no smart because of Miles Davis's participation. You know, I don't hate Miles. I just think he needs to be replaced in the historical context where he belongs. As one of many, not the leader of all. Because he certainly wasn't the leader of all men. He was never a leader really to begin with in a lot of ways. He certainly was good at being a band leader, but he wasn't the recruiter that people give him credit for. He doesn't take people out of high schools and local bands. He takes people that have ascended at other small labels and grafts them once they've already become somewhat signature names. Blakey was a great band leader. Blakey had found talent in local high schools as he was going through town, you know, and would ask his parents' permission if so-and-so can join the band for a while. Miles never quite goes that grassroots with his band leading and talent searching. He always had fairly semi-established names joining. Look at the second quintet. You know, Hancock, pretty well established. He's already been recording for Blue Note for a while. Carter, he's had a few things under his belt. He's done quite a bit of side work already. Shorter has certainly ascended through the Jazz Messengers, through his work at VJ, his leadership records at Blue Note. Shorter's already becoming a fairly important figure before Miles chooses him. You know, Tony Williams, the young drummer, 15, 16, 17 years old. His reputation was definitely growing. Being with Miles enhances all of their careers, no question. But anyway, Cannonball Adderly, Legend Series, something else. And boy, this record is something else. Daddy-O nailed it. This is royalty. It really is royalty. Hope you all enjoy the channel. If you want to help subscribe to the channel, hit that like button. Give it a thumbs up. If you want to help support the channel, you go to my Patreon page in the description below and pledge a few dollars a month just to help the channel out, help me survive. And if you want to buy some merchandise, there's some great Jazz Shepherd merchandise in the description below. Go to that store. All kinds of hoodies and t-shirts and coffee mugs. So appreciate all that kind of support. It definitely helps keep this channel going. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. We're supposed to get a bunch of rain today. Frankly, I like a nice spring rain. It's a nice day to listen to jazz. Y'all be safe. Talk to you soon. Peace.